Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean world entered one of the most dramatic and consequential periods in human history. Civilizations that had dominated politics, warfare, trade, and culture for centuries collapsed within a few generations. Palaces burned, cities were abandoned, writing systems vanished, and entire populations were displaced. For the people living through it, the collapse must have felt apocalyptic, an end to the known world. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions speak of a terrifying force arriving from beyond the horizon. These enemies came not only with weapons, but with families, wagons, livestock, and ships filled with entire communities. They moved relentlessly across land and sea, overwhelming kingdoms that had once seemed invincible. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. But the Sea Peoples were not merely villains from history's shadows. They were also human beings caught in a perfect storm of environmental disaster, economic collapse, and political failure. Their story is not simply one of invasion, it is a story of migration, survival, adaptation, and transformation. In this in-depth documentary script, we will explore the world before the collapse, examine the evidence for who the Sea Peoples were, analyze the causes behind their movements, and uncover how their arrival reshaped the ancient world forever. By unraveling their mysterious invasions, we gain insight into one of the most important turning points in global history. To understand the Sea Peoples, we must first understand the world they encountered, a world that, on the surface, appeared wealthy, stable, and powerful, yet beneath that prosperity hid deep structural fragility. Between roughly 1600 and 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East experienced what many historians consider a golden age. This was the Late Bronze Age, a period defined by international cooperation, long-distance trade, and complex political relationships that bound distant kingdoms together into a single, interconnected system. Never before had so many civilizations been so tightly linked, nor so dependent on one another for survival. The Late Bronze Age was not a collection of isolated empires rising and falling independently. Instead, it functioned as an early version of globalization. Kingdoms from Mycenaean Greece in the west to Mesopotamia in the east were bound together by maritime routes, overland caravans, and diplomatic agreements. Anatolia, the Levant, Cyprus, and Egypt formed the beating heart of this system, with goods, people, and ideas constantly in motion. Trade networks stretched across thousands of kilometers. Ships crossed the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean carrying raw materials and luxury goods, while caravans moved inland through mountain passes and deserts. These routes were not optional, they were essential. No major power of the Late Bronze Age was economically self-sufficient. Each region specialized in specific resources critical to the survival of the system. Cyprus supplied the majority of the copper needed to produce bronze, the metal that gave the age its name. Without Cypriot copper, weapons, tools, and armor could not be made. Tin, the other essential component of bronze, came from even farther away. Its sources remain debated, but evidence suggests it arrived from regions as distant as Central Asia, Anatolia, or even Europe. This meant that bronze production depended on trade routes that crossed multiple political boundaries. Egypt exported vast quantities of grain, made possible by the predictable flooding of the Nile. Egyptian gold, mined in Nubia, flowed north into the Near East, while papyrus became a prized writing material. Lebanon, known in antiquity as the land of the Phoenicians, provided cedar wood, tall, straight, and durable, used for shipbuilding, temples, and royal palaces across the region. Anatolia contributed silver, iron-rich ores, and horses, which were essential for chariot warfare and elite military units. This specialization made the system prosperous, but also dangerously fragile. If a single link failed, if tin shipments stopped, if grain deliveries were delayed, if a port city was destroyed, the effects were felt across the entire network. Prosperity depended on constant movement and mutual trust. Maintaining such an interconnected world required more than trade. It required diplomacy. The rulers of the Late Bronze Age developed an elaborate system of international relations designed to prevent large-scale war between the great powers. The clearest evidence of this system comes from the Amarna letters, a collection of clay tablets discovered in Egypt. Written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, these letters record correspondences between the kings of Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Babylonia, Assyria, and Mitanni. In these letters, kings addressed one another as brother, emphasizing equality among the great powers. They exchanged extravagant gifts, gold, fine textiles, precious stones, and sealed alliances through royal marriages. Egyptian princesses married foreign kings, and foreign princesses entered the Egyptian court, creating bonds that were both political and personal. Yet the Amarna letters also reveal a world under strain. Kings complained bitterly about gifts they considered inadequate. They accused one another of breaking promises or delaying shipments. Vassal rulers begged their overlords for military assistance as enemies closed in on their cities. Even during times of peace, tension simmered beneath the surface. The system required constant maintenance, and trust was always fragile. At the center of Late Bronze Age society stood the palace. These were not merely royal residences, they were the administrative, economic, and military hubs of entire kingdoms. Palace economies were highly centralized. Land officially belonged to the state or the king. Farmers worked fields assigned to them and delivered a portion of their harvest to palace storehouses. Craftsmen, potters, metalworkers, weavers were employed directly by the palace and produced goods for redistribution or trade. Soldiers were equipped, fed, and organized by palace administrations.
Chariots, the elite weapon of the age, required enormous resources: horses, skilled drivers, bronze fittings, and constant maintenance.
Only powerful centralized states could support such forces. This system created efficiency and control. It allowed rulers to mobilize armies quickly, manage large populations, and dominate regional politics. But it also created a dangerous dependency. When palaces functioned, society functioned. When palaces failed, everything collapsed. There was little redundancy, few independent markets, limited local autonomy. If a palace burned, its archives destroyed, and its administrators killed or dispersed, the surrounding population lost access to food distribution, protection, and economic organization almost overnight. To those living within it, the Late Bronze Age likely seemed permanent. Its trade routes were ancient, its diplomatic traditions deeply ingrained. Its great powers appeared unshakable. But beneath the surface, the system was overstretched. It depended on peace, predictable climate patterns, stable leadership, and uninterrupted trade.
Any major disruption, war, drought, natural disaster, or mass migration had the potential to unravel everything.
This was the world the Sea Peoples encountered: wealthy, interconnected, powerful, and critically vulnerable. When the storm finally came from the sea, it did not merely strike individual kingdoms. It shattered the delicate balance holding the entire Bronze Age world together. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age did not arrive suddenly, like a single catastrophic blow. Instead, it unfolded slowly, over decades, through a series of warning signs that many at the time may have misunderstood or underestimated. Long before the Sea Peoples appeared in force, the foundations of the Bronze Age world were already weakening. To later generations, the destruction might appear abrupt, but for those living through the late 13th century BCE, instability had become a constant presence. Natural disasters, rising violence, economic strain, and the gradual breakdown of trade all hinted at a system approaching its breaking point. One of the earliest and most widespread warning signs came from the Earth itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that a series of powerful earthquakes struck large parts of the eastern Mediterranean during the late 1200s BCE. Cities across Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant showed destruction layers consistent with seismic activity rather than warfare alone. At sites such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Troy, and the Hittite capital of Hattusa, walls collapsed, buildings fractured, and infrastructure was damaged beyond quick repair. In many cases, cities were rebuilt, at least initially. But rebuilding required enormous amounts of labor, materials, and administrative coordination. Palaces had to mobilize workers, redirect food supplies, and repair storage facilities, roads, and defenses. Each reconstruction strained resources that were already stretched thin. Repeated earthquakes were especially devastating. A single disaster could be absorbed. Multiple disasters, spaced over years or decades, eroded resilience. Some cities were rebuilt smaller and less fortified than before. Others show evidence of hasty repairs, suggesting urgency and desperation rather than long-term planning. For centralized palace economies, natural disasters posed a unique threat. If administrative centers were damaged or destroyed, record-keeping, taxation, and food distribution were disrupted. A damaged palace was not just a structural loss, it was the paralysis of an entire political system. As natural disasters weakened cities and strained economies, insecurity spread across land and sea. Trade routes that had once been relatively safe became increasingly dangerous. Pirates and raiders began targeting merchant ships along the eastern Mediterranean coast. These attacks were not isolated incidents, but part of a growing pattern of instability. Some of the most chilling evidence comes from the city of Ugarit, a wealthy port on the Syrian coast and one of the most important trade hubs of the Late Bronze Age. Clay tablets found in its ruins contain letters written in the final days before the city's destruction. These messages speak of fear, confusion, and desperation. Officials reported enemy ships appearing offshore. Merchant vessels failed to arrive. Requests for military assistance went unanswered. In one famous letter, a ruler pleads for help, writing in effect, "Where are the ships? The enemy is already here." These words capture a world unraveling in real time. Ugarit had depended on naval protection and alliances with powerful neighbors. When those systems failed, the city was left exposed. Coastal settlements across the region began fortifying their walls. Watchtowers were strengthened. Garrison forces were increased. But these measures were defensive and reactive, not solutions to the deeper problems threatening the system. Piracy was not new to the Bronze Age, but its scale and frequency appear to have increased dramatically in the decades before the collapse. Small groups of raiders could disrupt trade routes with minimal effort, targeting lightly defended merchant ships laden with valuable cargo. Some scholars believe these early pirates may have been forerunners of the Sea Peoples, displaced warriors, or communities testing the waters before larger migrations began. Others argue they were opportunists exploiting weakening state control. Regardless of their identity, the impact was the same. Confidence in the system eroded. Merchants hesitated to sail. Deliveries were delayed or canceled. Prices rose. Shortages followed. Once trade slowed, palace economies began to falter. The Bronze Age world was deeply dependent on long-distance trade, especially for strategic materials. This dependence was both its greatest strength and its most dangerous weakness. Bronze production required two essential ingredients, copper and tin. While copper was relatively abundant, tin was rare and geographically dispersed. Most kingdoms had no local access to it. Without tin shipments, bronze production came to a halt. Bronze was not merely a luxury metal, it was fundamental to society. Weapons, armor, farming tools, and everyday implements all depended on it. A disruption in bronze production affected everything from military readiness to food production. Even short-term interruptions could have severe consequences. Armies went unequipped. Farmers lacked tools. Repairing infrastructure became more difficult. The ripple effects spread quickly. Luxury goods were also affected. Elites who relied on imported items to demonstrate status and maintain loyalty found themselves unable to do so. Political legitimacy, often reinforced through gift-giving and redistribution, began to weaken. To many rulers, these problems may have seemed manageable in isolation. Earthquakes could be rebuilt. Pirates could be hunted down. Trade disruptions could be negotiated away. But the late Bronze Age system was not designed to handle multiple crises at once. Natural disasters weakened cities. Insecurity disrupted trade. Economic strain reduced military capacity. Political trust eroded. Each problem fed into the next, creating a cycle of decline that was difficult to reverse. By the time the Sea Peoples appeared in force, the world they encountered was already vulnerable, its defenses weakened, its economies strained, and its people increasingly desperate. The warning signs had been there for decades. The storm that followed did not strike a stable world. It struck a system already cracking under its own weight. The earliest written references to the Sea Peoples do not come from Greece, Anatolia, or the shattered cities of the Levant. They come from Egypt, the most powerful, centralized, and literate civilization of the Late Bronze Age. Thanks to Egypt's long tradition of monumental inscriptions and royal propaganda, it is here that the shadowy figures, later known as the Sea Peoples, first emerge from the darkness of history. By the early 12th century BCE, Egypt stood as one of the last great pillars of the Old World. While other kingdoms were already showing signs of strain, Egypt still possessed immense resources, a powerful army, and a deeply ingrained sense of cosmic order. Yet even Egypt could not escape the growing instability spreading across the Mediterranean.
Pharaoh Merneptah, the 13th son of the legendary Ramesses II, ascended the throne around 1213 BCE.
He inherited a kingdom that was outwardly strong but increasingly vulnerable beneath the surface. Ramesses II had ruled for over 60 years, projecting an image of eternal stability. But long reigns often masked unresolved problems, and Merneptah quickly found himself confronting threats on multiple fronts. Egypt's western border erupted in crisis when Libyan tribes, long a concern for Egyptian rulers, launched a major invasion into the Nile Delta. This conflict is recorded on the famous Merneptah stele, a massive stone inscription celebrating the pharaoh's victory.
Alongside the Libyans, however, appear unfamiliar names, foreign groups identified as coming from beyond Egypt's traditional enemies.
These groups are described as allies or mercenaries fighting alongside the Libyans, and they include peoples with no clear history in Egyptian records. The implication is unmistakable. New forces were entering the region, drawn into conflicts far from their original homelands. Even at this early stage, the threat was not limited to land. Egyptian texts also refer to enemies arriving by sea, a disturbing development for a civilization whose power had long been based on controlling predictable borders rather than defending coastlines from maritime invasion. The inscriptions from Merneptah's reign provide the first appearance of names that later become associated with the Sea Peoples. While the texts are brief and highly stylized, they represent a crucial historical turning point. For the first time, Egypt was confronting not just neighboring rivals, but mobile, unfamiliar groups whose origins lay beyond the traditional political map of the Near East. These were not simply rebellious vassals or long-known enemies. They were outsiders, entering the system at a moment when it was already under strain. Their presence suggests that population movements were already underway decades before the Great Collapse. The Sea Peoples did not suddenly appear during the reign of Ramesses III. They were the culmination of earlier waves of displacement and conflict. To understand how these encounters were recorded, it is essential to understand how the Egyptians viewed the world. Egyptian ideology was built around the concept of Ma'at, cosmic order, balance, and harmony. The pharaoh was not merely a king, he was the guardian of this order, responsible for maintaining stability against the forces of chaos known as Isfet. Foreign enemies, natural disasters, and social unrest were all framed as manifestations of chaos threatening the divine order of the universe. As a result, Egyptian historical records were never neutral accounts of events. They were ideological statements designed to reinforce the pharaoh's role as protector of the cosmos. Victories were celebrated in elaborate inscriptions and temple reliefs. Enemies were depicted as disorganized, cowardly, and doomed. Defeats, stalemates, and failures were rarely mentioned, if at all. This propagandistic approach presents a challenge for modern historians. Egyptian inscriptions often exaggerate victories, inflate enemy numbers, and simplify complex conflicts into clear moral narratives. A battle that was narrowly won, or even inconclusive, might be presented as a total annihilation of the enemy. However, propaganda itself can reveal important truths. The repeated appearance of sea-based enemies in Egyptian texts is significant. Pharaohs did not invent threats without reason. Monumental inscriptions were expensive, time-consuming, and politically motivated. If enemies arriving by sea were mentioned repeatedly, it suggests that they posed a genuine and ongoing concern. Moreover, the very need to portray the pharaoh as triumphing over chaos implies that chaos was increasingly visible and threatening. During Merneptah's reign, Egypt was still capable of defending itself successfully. The invasions were repelled, and the pharaoh proclaimed victory. Yet beneath the confident tone of the inscriptions lies a growing sense of alarm. Enemies were no longer confined to familiar regions. They were mobile, unpredictable, and capable of striking from multiple directions. Land and sea were no longer secure boundaries. The Egyptian military, long optimized for campaigns in Canaan and Nubia, now faced the challenge of defending the Nile Delta from seaborne incursions. This required new strategies, new deployments, and greater strain on resources. Merneptah's encounters with these foreign groups represent the opening act of a much larger drama. The Sea Peoples had not yet arrived in full force, but the conditions that would enable their later invasions were already in place. Population movements were underway. Trade networks were fraying. Political alliances were weakening. Egypt, though still strong, was being drawn into conflicts born of a collapsing world beyond its borders. In retrospect, Merneptah's reign marks a critical turning point. It was the moment when the old system first registered the shock of incoming waves that would soon crash across the entire Bronze Age world. The Sea Peoples were no longer a distant rumor. They had entered the historical record. And Egypt, for the first time, had glimpsed the storm gathering on the horizon. The Sea Peoples remain one of the most elusive groups in ancient history. They left behind no known written records of their own, no chronicles, no inscriptions, no clear statements of identity. Everything we know about them comes from the civilizations they encountered, especially Egypt. As a result, the names preserved in Egyptian inscriptions are our most direct and valuable clues. These names appear carved into stone temple walls, victory stelae, and reliefs celebrating Egyptian triumphs. They are brief, often listed without explanation, and shaped by the conventions of Egyptian writing. Yet within these few words lies a complex story of migration, conflict, and cultural transformation. Rather than representing a single people, the Sea Peoples appear to have been a loose coalition of different groups, each with its own origins, traditions, and motivations. Understanding these names helps us move beyond the idea of a single invading force and toward a more nuanced picture of a world in motion. Among the most recognizable of the Sea Peoples are the Sherdun. They are frequently depicted in Egyptian reliefs, wearing distinctive horned helmets and carrying round shields and long swords. These images have made the Sherdun iconic, often serving as the visual shorthand for the Sea Peoples as a whole. The origin of the Sherdun remains debated. Some scholars link their name to Sardinia, suggesting they may have come from the central Mediterranean. Others argue for an Aegean origin, pointing to similarities between Sherdun equipment and Mycenaean weaponry. The horned helmet, once thought unique, has parallels in Aegean and Anatolian contexts. What makes the Sherdun particularly intriguing is their relationship with Egypt. After early conflicts, some Sherdun appear to have entered Egyptian service as mercenaries. Egyptian texts and reliefs show Sherdun warriors fighting alongside Egyptian troops, guarding royal palaces, and serving as elite soldiers. This shift from enemy to ally suggests that the Sea Peoples were not uniformly hostile. Some groups integrated into existing power structures, adapting to new political realities rather than simply destroying them. The Shekelish are another group frequently mentioned in Egyptian invasion lists.
Their name has long attracted attention due to its possible connection to Sicily.
Linguistically, the similarity between Shekelish and Sikeloi, the ancient inhabitants of Sicily, has led many scholars to propose a central Mediterranean origin. If this connection is correct, it implies that the Sea Peoples were not limited to the Aegean, but included groups from much farther west.
This would dramatically expand the geographical scope of Bronze Age migration and conflict.
Archaeological evidence from Sicily during this period is limited, making definitive conclusions difficult. However, the presence of the Shekelish in multiple Egyptian records suggests they were a significant and recurring force, not a one-time anomaly. Their inclusion, alongside other Sea Peoples, hints at a broader movement of populations across the Mediterranean, possibly driven by shared pressures such as climate change, economic disruption, or internal conflict. The Denyen are among the most debated of the Sea Peoples due to their possible connection to Greek tradition. Some scholars associate the Denyen with the Danaans, a term used in Homeric epics to describe the Greeks who fought in the Trojan War. If this association is accurate, it would place at least part of the Sea Peoples firmly within the Mycenaean world. The collapse of Mycenaean palace centers around 1200 BCE could have displaced large numbers of warriors and civilians, pushing them into migration and conflict. Supporters of this theory point to similarities in names, weapons, and maritime traditions. Critics caution that linguistic similarities alone are not definitive proof. Nevertheless, the possibility that survivors of Mycenaean Greece became part of the Sea Peoples adds a tragic dimension to the story, former rulers reduced to refugees and raiders. Of all the Sea Peoples, the Peliset are the most widely recognized, largely because of their identification with the biblical Philistines. Egyptian records describe the Pelesit as one of the major groups involved in the invasions during the reign of Ramesses III. Archaeological evidence strongly supports this connection. In the southern Levant, particularly along the coastal plain, a new material culture appears around this time. Pottery styles, architectural layouts, and dietary practices show clear Aegean influences, distinct from earlier Canaanite traditions. Cities such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza became centers of Philistine culture. Over time, the Philistines adapted to their new environment, adopting local languages and religious practices while retaining elements of their original identity. The Peleset demonstrate that the Sea Peoples were not merely destroyers. They settled, built cities, and became part of the cultural landscape of the Iron Age Near East. Compared to the groups above, the Checker and Weshesh remain mysterious. They appear in Egyptian records, but leave little trace in the archaeological record. The Checker are sometimes associated with the coastal city of Dor in modern Israel, where evidence suggests a foreign population established control after the Bronze Age collapse.
The Weshesh, by contrast, are known only from inscriptions, with no clear archaeological or linguistic connections.
Their obscurity highlights one of the greatest challenges in studying the Sea Peoples. The evidence is incomplete and uneven.
Some groups left lasting marks on history, while others vanished almost entirely from the record.
The names of the Sea Peoples are fragments, echoes of identities shaped by migration, conflict, and survival. They remind us that the collapse of the Bronze Age was not caused by a single enemy or event, but by a convergence of forces that uprooted entire societies. Each name represents a community forced to adapt to a rapidly changing world. Together, they form a mosaic of the ancient Mediterranean at a moment of profound transformation. The Sea Peoples were not a monolith. They were many peoples, moving through a collapsing system, leaving behind traces that still challenge and intrigue historians more than 3,000 years later. Between 1200 and 1150 BCE, the world of the Late Bronze Age did not fall all at once. Instead, it collapsed in waves, each one weakening the foundations of civilization until entire kingdoms vanished from history. Cities that had stood for centuries were destroyed or abandoned. Trade routes fell silent. Writing systems disappeared. Populations scattered. What followed was one of the most profound systemic collapses humanity has ever experienced. This was not simply the fall of a single empire. It was the breakdown of an entire interconnected world. In the Aegean, the once powerful Mycenaean civilization entered its final crisis. For centuries, Mycenaean Greece had been dominated by fortified palace centers such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes. These palaces were not just royal residences, they were the administrative heart of Mycenaean society, controlling agriculture, trade, and military organization. Around 1200 BCE, these centers were systematically destroyed. Archaeological evidence shows widespread burning and abandonment. At Pylos, clay tablets written in Linear B were hastily fired in the flames that consumed the palace, preserving a snapshot of a society in panic. The texts record emergency preparations, mobilization of coast guards, distribution of weapons, and frantic attempts to organize defenses. Despite these efforts, the palaces fell. With their destruction came the collapse of Mycenaean bureaucracy. Linear B, the writing system used for administration, disappeared almost overnight. Trade with the Near East ceased, cutting Greece off from vital resources. Population levels dropped sharply as settlements were abandoned or reduced to small villages. The sophisticated palace culture of Mycenaean Greece gave way to centuries of decentralization and poverty. The world that would later produce Homer's epics was born from the ruins of this collapse. Farther east, the Hittite Empire suffered an even more dramatic fate. At its height, the Hittite state rivaled Egypt in power, controlling much of Anatolia and northern Syria. Its capital, Hattusa, was a massive fortified city filled with temples, archives, and royal palaces. By the early 12th century BCE, this empire ceased to exist. Hattusa was abandoned, its monumental buildings left to decay. Administrative archives disappeared, and central authority collapsed almost entirely. While some Hittite successor states survived in southern Anatolia and Syria, the core of the empire was gone. The reasons for this collapse remain debated. Internal rebellions, famine, invasion, and the disruption of trade all likely played a role. Letters from the final years of the Hittite state speak of grain shortages and desperate appeals for aid. Without food, armies could not be paid. Without armies, the empire could not defend itself. When pressure came from migrating peoples, raiders, or internal unrest, the system collapsed. Perhaps no city captures the tragedy of the Great Collapse more vividly than Ugarit.
Located on the Syrian coast, Ugarit was a cosmopolitan port city and a vital link in the international trade network.
Its people spoke multiple languages, traded with distant lands, and maintained close diplomatic ties with both the Hittites and Egypt.
In the final days of Ugarit, chaos reigned. Clay tablets recovered from the ruins include unfinished letters describing imminent danger.
Officials reported enemy ships approaching the coast.
Appeals for military assistance were sent, but no help arrived.
Ugarit was destroyed around 1190 BCE. The city was never rebuilt. Its sudden destruction marks the complete breakdown of the Late Bronze Age system. When a major trade hub like Ugarit could be wiped out without response from its allies, it was clear that the old world order had failed. Across Cyprus and the Aegean, archaeological evidence points to widespread destruction during this period. Coastal settlements were burned. Fortifications were hastily constructed or reinforced. Some sites show signs of repeated attacks, suggesting ongoing instability rather than a single catastrophic event. Cyprus, a key supplier of copper, was particularly affected. Disruption to Cypriot production crippled bronze manufacturing across the Mediterranean. Without copper, the Bronze Age economy could not function. In the Aegean, many islands were depopulated or abandoned. Trade networks that had connected Greece to Anatolia and the Levant fell silent. Maritime routes that once carried goods and people now carried fear. What makes the Great Collapse so remarkable is its scale and interconnectedness. No single cause can explain it. Instead, multiple pressures converged. Climate-driven drought reduced agricultural output. Earthquakes damaged cities and infrastructure. Trade disruptions caused shortages of critical materials. Political systems dependent on centralized control failed. Population movements and invasions overwhelmed weakened states. The Sea Peoples did not create these problems, but they moved through a world already breaking apart, accelerating the collapse.
By 1150 BCE, the Late Bronze Age world was gone.
In its place emerged a fragmented landscape of small kingdoms, migrating populations, and experimental new technologies. Iron gradually replaced bronze. Writing systems would eventually reappear, but the knowledge of the Old World was largely lost. The Great Collapse marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. It was a moment of profound destruction, but also of transformation. From the ashes of fallen palaces and burned cities, a new world would slowly take shape. And at the center of that transformation stood the shadowy figures known as the Sea Peoples. By the early 12th century BCE, the Late Bronze Age world lay in ruins. Great kingdoms had fallen, trade routes had collapsed, and entire populations were on the move. Against this backdrop of chaos rose Ramesses III, the last great warrior pharaoh of ancient Egypt, and the final major barrier standing between the Sea Peoples and total domination of the eastern Mediterranean. When Ramesses III ascended the throne around 1186 BCE, Egypt was no longer at its imperial peak. Though still powerful, it faced mounting pressures, declining revenues, restless populations, and threats along every border. To the north, once stable regions in the Levant had collapsed into lawless zones. To the west, Libyan groups pushed into Egyptian territory. And from the sea came a new and unprecedented danger. Unlike earlier raiders, the Sea Peoples were not merely warriors seeking loot. They moved with families, wagons, livestock, and ships, entire communities searching for new lands. Egyptian records describe these groups as having laid waste to the lands, leaving destruction in their wake. The implication was clear. This was not a raid. It was a migration driven by desperation. Ramesses III understood the magnitude of the threat. Rather than relying solely on Egypt's traditional land-based defenses, he prepared for a confrontation that would redefine warfare. The Nile Delta became the focal point of Egypt's defenses. Fortresses were reinforced. Troops were stationed along coastal routes. Most crucially, Ramesses III assembled a fleet, an extraordinary move in a civilization historically oriented toward land combat. Egyptian ships were relatively small, designed primarily for transport along the Nile. The Sea Peoples, by contrast, arrived in long, sea-going vessels capable of carrying warriors and families across open waters. Victory would depend not on brute strength, but on strategy. The most detailed account of the conflict comes from the temple complex at Medinet Habu, where massive reliefs depict the clash between Egyptian forces and the Sea Peoples. These carvings offer one of the earliest visual records of a naval battle in human history. The reliefs show Sea Peoples ships entering the Nile Delta, crowded with fighters armed with swords, spears, and distinctive round shields. Some wear feathered or horned helmets, details that match depictions of groups like the Shirdan and Peliset. Egypt's response was calculated and devastating. Rather than meeting the enemy on open water, Egyptian commanders lured the sea peoples into the narrow channels of the delta. There, their larger ships lost mobility. Archers lined the riverbanks and rained arrows onto the trapped vessels. Egyptian ships maneuvered in close quarters, grappling enemy boats and boarding them. The scene is one of organized slaughter. Enemies are shown falling into the water, drowning beneath their armor. Captured warriors are bound and presented before the pharaoh. The message was unmistakable. Chaos had been defeated by order. Ramesses III claimed total victory, declaring that the sea peoples were annihilated and that Egypt had been saved from destruction. In a narrow sense, this was true. Egypt did not collapse as Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, and Ugarit had. But survival came at a cost. Despite repelling the invasions, Egypt's imperial reach was broken. Control over Canaan and Syria was lost. Former vassal states disappeared or became independent. Trade revenues declined sharply, depriving the state of wealth needed to sustain its bureaucracy and military. Internally, Egypt faced economic strain. Records from Ramesses III's reign include the first documented labor strike in history, as workers at Deir el-Medina protested delayed grain rations. The central administration struggled to provide basic necessities. The empire had survived, but it was no longer an empire. One of the most revealing aspects of Ramesses III's response was what happened after the battles. Egyptian texts suggest that some sea peoples were not killed or expelled, but settled within Egyptian-controlled territory. The Peliset, widely identified with the Philistines, were allowed to establish themselves in the southern Levant. There, they built cities such as Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod, forming a new regional power that would shape Near Eastern history for centuries. This decision reveals an important truth. The Sea Peoples were not simply invaders to be destroyed. They were displaced populations looking for stability in a collapsing world. Egypt's survival depended not only on military strength, but on its ability to absorb and manage these newcomers.
Ramesses III is often described as the last great pharaoh of Egypt's new kingdom. After his death, Egypt entered a long period of decline marked by internal conflict, economic weakness, and reduced international influence. The battles against the Sea Peoples represent more than a military victory. They mark the final chapter of the Late Bronze Age. After Ramesses III, the old system of great interconnected empires never fully returned. Iron technology spread. New political entities emerged. Warfare, trade, and diplomacy were transformed. The Sea Peoples did not destroy civilization, but they arrived at the moment it was most vulnerable. Ramesses III stood at the crossroads of history, fighting not just an enemy, but the consequences of centuries of interconnectedness collapsing under its own weight. His victories delayed Egypt's fall, but they could not reverse the forces reshaping the Mediterranean world. The Age of Bronze had ended. A new, uncertain era had begun, and the echoes of those final battles would shape history for generations to come. The traditional image of the Sea Peoples is one of relentless warriors crashing against the shores of the ancient world. Yet the evidence tells a more complex and more human story. Egyptian reliefs do not depict armies alone. They show something far more unusual for ancient warfare. Women, children, carts, and household goods traveling alongside fighters. These were not merely invasions. They were migrations on a massive scale. At Medinet Habu, among the carved scenes of battle and victory, one detail stands out. Behind the warriors come wagons pulled by oxen, carrying women and children. Some figures sit beneath makeshift coverings, holding belongings that represent everything they have left behind. This imagery is unprecedented in Egyptian military art. Armies do not usually bring families into combat zones. The presence of entire households suggests that these groups did not expect to return home, because there was no home left to return to. The Sea Peoples were not marching from a single homeland. They were moving away from destruction. By the early 12th century BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was in crisis. Prolonged droughts reduced harvests. Earthquakes shattered cities. Trade networks collapsed, cutting off access to food and essential materials. Political systems dependent on centralized control failed, leaving populations unprotected. In such conditions, migration becomes survival. Archaeological layers across Greece, Anatolia, and the Aegean show sudden abandonment of settlements. Entire regions were depopulated. People did not vanish, they moved. The Sea Peoples may represent the most visible expression of this mass displacement. These were refugees of collapse, forced onto the roads and seas by hunger, insecurity, and the failure of states that had once guaranteed stability. In the late Bronze Age, the Mediterranean was not a barrier, it was a highway. Coastal and island communities depended on maritime travel for trade, communication, and fishing. When land routes became dangerous or unproductive, the sea offered an alternative. Ships became lifeboats. Groups uprooted by famine or war could load families and possessions and seek new lands across the water. This helps explain the speed and scale of the Sea Peoples movement. It also explains why their arrival felt so sudden and overwhelming to settled civilizations. What Egyptian sources describe as invasion may, in many cases, have been desperate attempts to land, settle, and survive. Migration, however, rarely occurs peacefully when resources are scarce. As displaced groups arrived in already stressed regions, conflict became inevitable. Local populations struggled to defend limited farmland, water sources, and cities. What began as refugee movement could quickly turn violent. Some groups likely attempted negotiation or peaceful settlement. Others resorted to force when turned away. Archaeological evidence shows both patterns. Destruction layers in some cities, continuity and cultural blending in others. This mixed outcome reflects the chaos of the time. There was no unified response, no international authority to manage the crisis. Every city and kingdom faced the migrants alone.
In several regions, the Sea Peoples did not simply pass through, they stayed. The best-known example is the Peliset, widely identified with the Philistines. After their defeat by Egypt, they were allowed, or compelled, to settle in the southern Levant. There, they built cities, adopted local crops, and blended their own traditions with those of Canaanite society. Archaeology reveals distinct pottery styles, architectural features, and dietary practices that point to Aegean influences. Yet within generations, these settlers had become deeply rooted in their new land. This pattern likely repeated elsewhere. Migrants adapted to local conditions, intermarried with existing populations, and created new identities. The world that emerged after the late Bronze Age collapse was not empty, it was reshaped. It is easy to speak of collapse in terms of empires and cities. But behind those abstractions were millions of individual lives disrupted or destroyed. Families fled burning settlements.
Children grew up without the traditions and institutions their parents had known.
Skills, stories, and technologies were lost as communities fragmented. The Sea Peoples represent the human face of this catastrophe. Their movement reminds us that history's great turning points are lived not only by kings and generals, but by ordinary people forced to make impossible choices. Modern scholarship increasingly challenges the idea of the Sea Peoples as a single, unified enemy. There is no evidence of a central leader, shared ideology, or coordinated strategy across all groups. Instead, the term Sea Peoples may reflect an Egyptian attempt to categorize a complex phenomenon, multiple displaced populations arriving from different directions at roughly the same time. To Egyptian officials, these newcomers appeared as a single threat. To themselves, they were survivors seeking land, safety, and food. The migrations of the early 12th century BCE marked a turning point in human history. Never before had so many interconnected societies collapsed so quickly. Never before had such large populations been forced into motion across land and sea. Out of this chaos came transformation. New cultures emerged. New technologies spread. The rigid hierarchies of the Bronze Age gave way to more localized, adaptable societies. While the collapse brought suffering, it also laid the groundwork for the Iron Age world that followed. The Sea Peoples were not merely destroyers of civilization. They were products of its failure and agents of the new world that rose from its ruins. For generations, historians searched for dramatic causes behind the collapse of the Late Bronze Age: mysterious invaders, sudden wars, or the fall of powerful kings. Yet modern science has revealed a quieter, more relentless force at work beneath the chaos. Climate change and environmental stress did not strike with swords or ships, but their impact was profound, reshaping the Mediterranean world and setting the stage for mass migration, conflict, and collapse. Unlike ancient chronicles, climate does not lie in inscriptions or monuments. Instead, it leaves traces in the natural world: tree rings, lake sediments, cave formations, and fossilized pollen. Over the past few decades, scientists have used these clues to reconstruct the climate of the Late Bronze Age with increasing precision. Tree ring analysis from Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean shows periods of sharply reduced growth beginning in the late 13th century BCE. Narrow rings indicate years of insufficient rainfall, sometimes stretching across decades. These patterns suggest not a single drought, but prolonged episodes of dryness that placed sustained pressure on agricultural systems. Lake sediments from regions such as Cyprus and the Levant tell a similar story.
Layers formed during this period show higher concentrations of dust and reduced organic material, signs of declining vegetation and falling water levels.
Pollen records reveal a drop in cereal crops alongside an increase in drought-resistant plants, indicating that farmers struggled to maintain traditional agriculture. Together, these independent lines of evidence point to a widespread and long-lasting climatic shift. The Late Bronze Age world was built on agricultural surplus. Palaces, armies, and trade networks all depended on stable food production. While Egypt benefited from the Nile's relatively predictable flooding, much of the eastern Mediterranean relied on rainfall agriculture, highly vulnerable to climate fluctuations. Even a few years of reduced rainfall could devastate harvests. Prolonged drought, lasting decades, was catastrophic. Grain shortages rippled through the system. Farmers, unable to meet palace quotas, lost land or status. State storehouses emptied. Trade in food staples became increasingly desperate, as seen in letters from Hittite and Levantine rulers begging Egypt for grain shipments. When food fails, political authority follows. Starvation undermines more than physical health, it destroys trust in leadership. Rulers who could not feed their people lost legitimacy. Soldiers went unpaid. Local officials hoarded resources. Corruption spread as desperation grew. Texts from the final years of the Hittite Empire speak of hunger so severe that the state could not sustain its population. Ugarit's desperate appeals for aid suggest similar conditions. Even Egypt, traditionally insulated from famine, experienced grain shortages and labor unrest during the reign of Ramesses III. In such an environment, loyalty to the state weakened. Communities turned inward, prioritizing survival over obedience. Some rebelled, others fled. Environmental stress did not force migration overnight. Instead, it slowly eroded the foundations of daily life. Wells dried. Fields failed. Livestock died. Families faced a choice: stay and starve, or leave and risk the unknown. For coastal and island populations, the sea offered escape. Boats became vehicles of survival, carrying not traders but refugees. Entire communities loaded what they could and sailed toward lands rumored to be more fertile or stable. These movements, multiplied across regions, created waves of migration that overwhelmed already weakened states. The sea peoples were not born from aggression alone, they were shaped by hunger. When migrants arrived in new lands, they encountered societies struggling with the same environmental pressures. Resources were limited. Arable land was precious. Competition quickly turned violent. Cities fortified their walls. Raiders targeted storehouses. Local conflicts escalated into regional wars. What ancient sources describe as invasion may, in many cases, have been clashes between desperate populations fighting for survival. Climate change did not dictate human behavior, but it narrowed the range of choices. The Late Bronze Age system was remarkably sophisticated, but also rigid. Its centralized palaces and long-distance trade networks thrived in stable conditions. They were far less adaptable in times of sustained stress. When drought disrupted food production and trade, there was no mechanism to rapidly decentralize or redistribute power. Instead, failures cascaded. One collapsed state destabilized its neighbors, creating a domino effect across the Mediterranean. In contrast, the societies that emerged after the collapse were smaller, more localized, and often more resilient to environmental change. The role of climate change in the Late Bronze Age collapse does not diminish the importance of human agency. Leaders still made choices. Wars were still fought. But environmental stress shaped the context in which those decisions were made. The sea peoples, once seen only as destroyers, can now be understood as participants in a much larger crisis, one driven by forces beyond any single kingdom's control. The ruins of palaces and abandoned fields tell a story not just of violence, but of vulnerability. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age was not inevitable. It was the result of a complex interaction between environment, economy, and human systems pushed beyond their limits. Climate change did not end the ancient world, but it exposed its weaknesses. As modern science peels back the layers of time, the lesson becomes clear. Even the most advanced civilizations are only as resilient as the environments that sustain them. And when that balance is broken, the consequences can reshape history itself. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age did not only destroy cities and empires, it dismantled the technological foundation of an entire civilization. For centuries, bronze had been the metal that shaped warfare, agriculture, and power itself. When the global trade networks that supplied its ingredients collapsed, the Bronze Age quite literally ran out of metal. From this crisis emerged a new material that would redefine the ancient world: iron. Bronze is an alloy, typically made from copper and tin. While copper was relatively widespread, tin was rare and unevenly distributed across the ancient world. Its sources lay hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers from the cities that needed it. This made bronze not just a material, but a product of long-distance trade. As long as the Late Bronze Age system functioned, this was sustainable. Copper flowed from Cyprus, tin arrived from distant regions, and palaces coordinated production and distribution. Weapons, tools, and luxury items were manufactured in controlled workshops under state supervision. When trade collapsed, bronze production collapsed with it. Archaeological evidence from the early 12th century BCE shows a sharp decline in bronze artifacts. Hordes of broken tools and weapons appear, suggesting that communities were melting down old objects to reuse precious metal. In some regions, bronze virtually disappears from the archaeological record for generations. The loss of bronze had immediate consequences for warfare. Bronze swords, spears, and armor were the backbone of Late Bronze Age armies. Without access to fresh supplies, states could no longer equip or maintain professional forces. This weakened centralized authority even further. Kings who could not arm their soldiers could not enforce their rule. City defenses crumbled. Local militias replaced standing armies, shifting power away from palaces and towards smaller, more autonomous communities. Violence did not disappear, but it changed in character. Iron was not unknown during the Bronze Age. Small iron objects had existed for centuries, often made from meteoric iron and treated as rare prestige items. What changed after the collapse was necessity. Iron ore was far more abundant than tin. It could be found in many regions that had once relied on imported bronze. For communities cut off from trade, iron offered a potential solution, if they could learn to work it. Iron was harder to smelt and forge than bronze. It required higher temperatures, specialized knowledge, and repeated hammering to remove impurities. Early iron tools were often inferior to high-quality bronze weapons. They rusted easily and were difficult to shape. Yet iron had one overwhelming advantage. It was local. The transition from bronze to iron was not immediate. It took centuries for ironworking techniques to improve and spread. Early iron tools appear sporadically, often alongside continued use of bronze where possible. Over time, blacksmiths learned to carburize iron, creating stronger, steel-like materials. Techniques were refined, passed down through generations, and adapted to local conditions.
This process did not require large palace workshops.
Ironworking could be done on a smaller scale, empowering local communities rather than centralized states. As iron technology improved, its impact on warfare became transformative. Iron weapons could be produced in greater numbers, allowing larger segments of society to bear arms. Warfare became less the domain of elite chariot warriors and more the responsibility of infantry equipped with spears and swords. This democratization of violence altered social structures. Power shifted away from hereditary elites toward leaders who could organize and command armed populations. The heroic chariot warfare celebrated in late Bronze Age art gave way to massed infantry combat that would define the Iron Age.
The weapons changed, and so did the rules of war.
The rise of iron reshaped more than armies. Iron tools improved agriculture, allowing deeper plowing and more efficient land clearing. This supported population recovery after the collapse and enabled settlement in previously marginal regions. Craft specialization evolved. Blacksmiths became central figures in their communities, often surrounded by ritual and myth. In many cultures, ironworking was seen as magical or dangerous, reflecting its transformative power. Trade did not disappear, but it became more regional. Instead of vast international networks controlled by palaces, smaller trade systems connected neighboring communities. The shift from bronze to iron symbolizes the broader transformation of the ancient world. The Bronze Age was defined by interconnectedness, centralized authority, and elite control of resources. The Iron Age emerged from fragmentation, adaptation, and resilience. The Sea Peoples and the collapse they accompanied did not end civilization, but they closed one chapter and opened another. Iron did not restore the old world. It built a new one. By 1000 BCE, the Mediterranean was populated by societies fundamentally different from those of the Late Bronze Age. New kingdoms rose. New identities formed. Writing systems reappeared. Trade slowly expanded once more, but the memory of the old interconnected system was gone. From the ashes of collapse, humanity forged a harder, more flexible future. The Age of Bronze ended not with a single battle, but with the quiet exhaustion of a system that could no longer sustain itself. Iron rose not because it was superior, but because it was available. In the end, it was adaptability, not power, that shaped the next era of history. Among all the groups labeled as the Sea Peoples, none are better documented than the Philistines. Known in Egyptian texts as the Peliset, they provide a rare opportunity to trace the journey from migration and conflict to settlement and cultural integration. Through archaeology, we can watch an identity take shape, one forged not only by origins, but by adaptation. Following the battles against Ramesses III, Egyptian sources suggest that some Sea Peoples were defeated, others repelled, and a few deliberately resettled. The Peliset were among those who remained. They settled along the southern Levantine coast, a fertile region controlling vital trade routes between Egypt and the Near East. There, they established what would later be known as the Philistine Pentapolis, 5 major cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath.
These cities rose rapidly in the early Iron Age, suggesting organized settlement rather than gradual infiltration.
The Philistines did not simply occupy ruins. They built new urban centers that reflected both their origins and their new environment. Excavations in Philistine cities have uncovered material culture unlike anything previously seen in the region. One of the clearest indicators is pottery. Early Philistine ceramics closely resemble Mycenaean IIIC pottery from the Aegean world. The shapes, decorative patterns, and firing techniques point to direct cultural transmission rather than imitation. This suggests that skilled potters migrated with the Philistines, or that communities maintained strong memories of their ancestral traditions. Architecture tells a similar story. Early Philistine buildings include hearths and layouts uncommon in Canaanite settlements, but typical of Aegean domestic structures. Even dietary practices stand out. Animal bones indicate a heavy consumption of pork, a sharp contrast with neighboring cultures. Taken together, these details paint a picture of newcomers maintaining a distinct identity in their early generations. Over time, however, this distinctiveness faded. By the 10th century BCE, Philistine material culture had changed dramatically. Pottery styles became increasingly local. Aegean designs were simplified, then abandoned altogether. Architectural practices adapted to Levantine norms. Most telling is the disappearance of the Philistine language, if it ever existed as a separate tongue. Written records from the region are in local Semitic languages. Personal names gradually align with those of neighboring peoples. This transformation was not sudden. It unfolded over generations as the Philistines interacted with surrounding communities through trade, intermarriage, and conflict. Importantly, assimilation did not mean disappearance. The Philistines retained a distinct identity long after their material culture blended with that of the region. Biblical texts, though written centuries later and from a hostile perspective, consistently distinguish Philistines from Israelites and other groups. Religious practices also reveal cultural blending. Philistine deities, such as Dagon, reflect local religious traditions, yet their rituals and temple layouts show influences that may trace back to earlier Aegean customs. This hybrid identity, neither fully foreign nor fully local, is the hallmark of successful migration. Relations between the Philistines and their neighbors were complex. Archaeology and texts suggest periods of both warfare and cooperation. As newcomers settling strategic coastal lands, the Philistines inevitably clashed with inland populations competing for resources and influence. Yet trade networks also connected them to surrounding regions, integrating them into the economic life of the Levant. Their cities became hubs of innovation and exchange during the early Iron Age, benefiting from access to maritime routes and new technologies. The Philistines were among the first groups in the region to adopt ironworking on a large scale. While the extent of their technological advantage is debated, early iron artifacts appear in Philistine contexts, suggesting familiarity with emerging metallurgical techniques. This may have contributed to their military strength and regional influence during the formative centuries of the Iron Age. More broadly, the Philistines exemplify how post-collapse societies adapted. They did not attempt to recreate the late Bronze Age world. Instead, they embraced new political structures, technologies, and cultural forms suited to a fragmented environment. The story of the Philistines challenges the image of the Sea Peoples as mere destroyers. Archaeology reveals builders, farmers, artisans, and traders, people capable of long-term settlement and cultural creativity. Their journey from migrants to regional power underscores a key theme of the Late Bronze Age collapse. Destruction and creation were intertwined. The Philistines did not inherit a stable world.
They helped create a new one.
Through the Philistines, we gain rare insight into how displaced populations reshaped the ancient Mediterranean. Their story shows that identity is not fixed, but negotiated across generations. They arrived as outsiders. They adapted. They endured. In the end, the Philistines were not simply a footnote in the story of the Sea Peoples. They were living proof that even in the aftermath of collapse, human societies find ways to rebuild, redefine, and thrive. When the palaces of the Late Bronze Age fell, and the great trade networks collapsed, the ancient Mediterranean entered a period long described as a Dark Age. For centuries, historians imagined this era as a time of ignorance, stagnation, and cultural amnesia. Yet darkness, in this case, reflects the limits of our sources more than the reality of life itself. What followed the collapse was not the end of civilization, but a profound reorganization of society. The defining feature of the post-collapse world was decentralization. The great palace states that had once controlled land, labor, and trade were gone. In their place emerged small, self-sufficient communities, villages rather than capitals, local leaders rather than divine kings. In Greece, monumental architecture disappeared. There were no palaces, no large administrative centers, no elaborate tombs like those of the Mycenaean elites. Settlements shrank or relocated to defensible hilltops. Life became simpler, but also more flexible. This decentralization was not necessarily a regression. Without the burden of maintaining massive bureaucracies and elite lifestyles, communities adapted to local conditions. Power was redistributed, and social hierarchies became less rigid. One of the most striking features of the so-called Dark Age was the disappearance of writing, especially in Greece. The Mycenaean administrative script, Linear B, had been used exclusively by palace scribes to record inventories, rations, and labor obligations. When the palaces fell, the need for this system vanished. There was no longer a centralized authority requiring detailed record-keeping. For several centuries, Greece was largely non-literate. This absence of writing has often been mistaken for intellectual decline. In reality, it reflects a shift in how knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Writing had never been widespread. It served elite administrative purposes. Its loss did not mean that people forgot their past. It meant they remembered it differently. Without writing, memory became cultural capital. Skills, traditions, and histories were passed orally from generation to generation. Agricultural techniques, metalworking knowledge, and social customs survived through practice and storytelling. Communities relied on elders, rituals, and shared experiences to preserve continuity. This system was fragile but resilient. Oral knowledge could adapt to new circumstances in ways written records could not. As environments changed and societies reorganized, traditions evolved alongside them. One of the most enduring legacies of the post-collapse world was the development of epic poetry. In Greece, stories of heroes, wars, and lost kingdoms circulated orally for centuries before being written down. These narratives preserved echoes of the Bronze Age world, great kings, fortified cities, chariots, and distant voyages, even as the societies that produced them had vanished. The Iliad and the Odyssey, attributed to Homer and recorded centuries later, are not historical records in the modern sense. Yet they carry cultural memory. They reflect a world remembered through song rather than stone. Epic poetry served multiple functions. It entertained, instructed, and unified communities. It transmitted values such as honor, loyalty, and courage. It also preserved a sense of shared identity during a time when political unity was absent. Despite the lack of monumental art and written texts, the so-called Dark Age was a period of quiet innovation. Iron technology spread and improved. New farming methods increased productivity. Pottery styles evolved, becoming more localized and expressive. Trade networks, though smaller, began to re-emerge. In Greece, population levels slowly recovered. Settlements expanded. By the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, signs of increasing complexity appear. Larger villages, social stratification, and renewed long-distance contact. This gradual recovery laid the foundation for the explosive cultural growth of the Archaic period. The return of writing marked a turning point. When the Greek alphabet emerged in the early 1st millennium BCE, it was not a revival of Linear B. It was a new system, adapted from Phoenician scripts and modified to record vowels. Unlike earlier writing systems, it was accessible to more than palace scribes. Writing was no longer just for kings, it belonged to communities. This democratization of literacy transformed Greek society, enabling new forms of political organization, law, and philosophy. Ironically, it was the collapse of the Old World that made this transformation possible. The term Dark Age reflects the perspective of historians searching for lost empires and written records. From the viewpoint of the people who lived through it, this era was one of adaptation, survival, and gradual renewal. The collapse stripped away the grandeur of the Late Bronze Age, but it also removed its constraints. What emerged was not darkness, but a different kind of light, smaller, quieter, and more human. The centuries following the Bronze Age collapse shaped the future of the Mediterranean world. They forged new identities, new technologies, and new ways of remembering the past. The sea peoples, the migrations, and the environmental crises did not end history. They redirected it. Out of fragmentation came creativity. Out of silence came song. And out of collapse came the foundations of the classical world that would one day dominate history's stage. For more than a century, historians have wrestled with a single haunting question. Did the Sea Peoples destroy the Late Bronze Age world? Or were they themselves the product of its collapse? Ancient Egyptian inscriptions portray them as ruthless invaders, while early modern scholars often accepted this view at face value. Yet as archaeological and scientific evidence has accumulated, a far more complex picture has emerged, one that challenges the idea of simple causation. For much of the 20th century, the dominant narrative was straightforward. Around 1200 BCE, A confederation of seafaring peoples swept across the Mediterranean, burning cities, toppling empires, and ushering in centuries of decline. This interpretation was reinforced by vivid Egyptian reliefs, destruction layers across the Near East, and the sudden disappearance of powerful states. In this view, the sea peoples were the primary agents of collapse, an external shock that shattered a previously stable world. But this explanation raises difficult questions. How could loosely organized groups defeat the largest empires of their age? Why did so many civilizations collapse simultaneously, even in regions not directly attacked? And why do signs of stress appear decades before the supposed invasions? These inconsistencies led scholars to reconsider the evidence. Modern research reveals that the Late Bronze Age system was fragile long before the Sea Peoples appeared in historical records. Its strength, extreme interconnectedness, was also its greatest weakness. Empires depended on long-distance trade for essential materials. Political authority rested on centralized palaces vulnerable to disruption. Agriculture relied on predictable climate patterns that no longer held. When drought reduced harvests, trade faltered. When trade faltered, bronze production declined. When armies weakened, borders became porous. Each failure intensified the next. By the late 13th century BCE, the system was under immense pressure. Rather than a single cause, the collapse now appears to have resulted from a convergence of forces, a perfect storm. Climate change triggered prolonged droughts, reducing food supplies and destabilizing agricultural economies. Earthquakes damaged cities and infrastructure. Economic fragility left states unable to respond effectively. Political systems dependent on centralized control proved inflexible in the face of sustained crisis. Into this unstable environment came mass migration. The Sea Peoples were not an isolated phenomenon. They were part of a broader movement of displaced populations searching for survival in a world that could no longer support them. Migration alone does not destroy civilizations. But in a weakened system, it can become a powerful accelerant. As groups moved across land and sea, they placed additional strain on regions already struggling with scarcity. Competition for food, land, and security intensified. Conflicts multiplied. Some cities fell to violence. Others collapsed under the weight of refugees they could not sustain. The Sea Peoples did not create the crisis, but they magnified it. This helps explain why Egypt, though challenged, survived. Its agricultural base was more resilient, its bureaucracy more adaptable, and its leadership able to mobilize resources effectively. Other states, already hollowed out by famine and internal weakness, could not withstand the additional pressure. Another key insight is that the Sea Peoples were not a single unified group. Egyptian texts list multiple names: Shurdan, Peliset, Denyen, Shekelesh, each with distinct origins and trajectories. Some were former mercenaries. Others were displaced farmers or sailors. Some settled peacefully, others fought violently. Their only common trait may have been movement itself. To ancient observers, these diverse groups appeared as a single threat. To modern scholars, they represent a complex mosaic of human responses to collapse. One of the most important shifts in modern scholarship is the recognition that the Late Bronze Age collapse was not a sudden catastrophe, but a prolonged process. Cities were destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again. Trade declined unevenly. Some regions adapted more successfully than others. The Sea Peoples appear in this story not as the opening act, but as one chapter in a long unraveling. This perspective reframes the Sea Peoples from villains to indicators, signals that the system had reached a breaking point. Asking whether the Sea Peoples were the cause or the symptom may, in the end, be the wrong question. They were both, and neither. They were not the architects of collapse, but neither were they passive victims. They were active agents responding to environmental, economic, and political pressures beyond their control. Their movements reshaped the Mediterranean world, accelerating the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. They did not end an age. They arrived when an age could no longer sustain itself. The story of the Sea Peoples offers a powerful lesson about complexity and resilience. Civilizations rarely fall because of a single factor. They collapse when multiple systems fail at once, leaving societies unable to adapt. The Late Bronze Age was a world of extraordinary achievement, but also of deep vulnerability. Its collapse reminds us that interconnectedness brings both strength and risk. So, were the Sea Peoples the cause or the symptom? They were the symptom of a world in crisis, and one of the forces that ensured that crisis became irreversible. Their story is not one of sudden destruction, but of transformation under pressure. It is a reminder that history is shaped not only by conquerors, but by conquerors, refugees, and ordinary people struggling to survive extraordinary times. And in that sense, the Sea Peoples are not an ancient mystery alone. They are a mirror, reflecting the enduring dynamics of human societies on the brink. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age is often remembered for what it destroyed: empires, cities, and long-standing traditions. Yet history did not end in smoke and silence. From the ruins of fallen palaces and abandoned trade routes, new societies emerged. These cultures did not preserve the Bronze Age world. They transformed it. Out of collapse came reinvention, and from that reinvention arose the civilizations that would shape the Classical Age. When the great powers disappeared, they left behind a vacuum. Central authority was gone. Borders were fluid. Old hierarchies had been dismantled. For the first time in centuries, smaller communities could define themselves without the shadow of imperial control. This environment was dangerous, but it was also full of opportunity. New societies were not burdened by the rigid palace economies of the Bronze Age. They adapted to local conditions, relied on regional trade rather than global networks, and experimented with new forms of political organization. The world became less centralized, but more flexible. Along the eastern Mediterranean coast, a group of maritime cities survived where empires failed. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and other Phoenician centers avoided total destruction during the collapse. Their strength lay in adaptability. The Phoenicians embraced the sea not as a battlefield, but as a network of opportunity. With long-distance overland trade disrupted, they expanded maritime commerce, linking the Mediterranean through shipping, navigation, and entrepreneurship. They carried timber, textiles, metal goods, and ideas across vast distances. More importantly, they spread one of the most influential technologies in history, the alphabet. Derived from earlier scripts but simplified and accessible, the Phoenician alphabet allowed writing to move beyond palace scribes. Merchants, sailors, and craftsmen could now record transactions and communication. This innovation would shape Greek, Latin, and eventually modern alphabets. The Phoenicians did not rebuild the Bronze Age system. They replaced it with something leaner and more enduring. In the hill country of the southern Levant, a different kind of society emerged. The Israelites formed not as an empire, but as a collection of rural communities bound by shared traditions, beliefs, and laws. Their early development reflects the post-collapse world: small settlements, limited resources, and a focus on local survival. Unlike the palace societies of the Bronze Age, Israelite identity centered on covenant, memory, and moral law rather than monumental architecture. Oral tradition played a vital role. Stories of ancestors, migrations, and divine encounters preserved collective memory during centuries without widespread writing. When texts were eventually recorded, they reflected generations of lived experience rather than centralized administration. The Israelites built continuity not through empire, but through shared narrative and belief, an approach well suited to a decentralized world. In Greece, the aftermath of collapse led to centuries of decentralization. Yet from this fragmentation emerged one of history's most influential cultures. Without palaces or kings, Greek communities experimented. Local leaders gained authority through persuasion rather than divine right. Iron technology spread. Trade slowly resumed. By the 8th century BCE, population growth and renewed contact with the wider Mediterranean sparked a cultural renaissance. The Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet and transformed it, adding vowels to create a system capable of capturing spoken language with precision. This innovation allowed oral traditions, once preserved only through performance, to be written down. From this process came epic poetry, law codes, philosophy, and eventually democracy. The memory of the Bronze Age lived on in myth, but the society that emerged was fundamentally new. What united these post-Bronze Age civilizations was not continuity, but creativity. They borrowed from the past while rejecting its limitations. They adopted iron over bronze, villages over palaces, flexible trade over rigid networks. Authority became more localized. Identity became more communal. The collapse cleared space for innovation by removing entrenched elites and outdated systems. What followed was not immediate prosperity, but long-term resilience. By 1000 BCE, the Mediterranean had been reshaped. Instead of a few dominant empires, it was a mosaic of cultures, interconnected, competitive, and dynamic. Trade returned, but in new forms. Writing spread, but more widely. Warfare changed. Religion evolved. Memory of the old world survived in stories, rituals, and ruins, but it no longer defined the present. The Sea Peoples, once seen only as destroyers, were part of this transformation. Their movements disrupted the old order, but also contributed to the diversity of the new one. The rise of the Phoenicians, Israelites, and Greeks demonstrates a profound historical truth. Collapse is not the opposite of progress. It is often its catalyst. The late Bronze Age fell because it could not adapt to sustained pressure. The world that followed succeeded precisely because it could. From the ashes of empire arose cultures that valued flexibility, memory, and innovation. These societies did not rebuild the past, they reimagined the future. The story of the Sea Peoples and the Late Bronze Age collapse is not one of permanent loss. It is a story of transformation on a civilizational scale. Old worlds died, new worlds were born. And in the long arc of history, it is often from the deepest ruins that the strongest foundations are laid. The story of the Sea Peoples feels distant, anchored in bronze weapons, ancient ships, and long-forgotten empires. Yet the forces that shaped the collapse of the Late Bronze Age are not confined to the past. They echo into the present, offering uncomfortable but valuable lessons about the fragility of complex systems and the human cost of systemic failure. The Late Bronze Age was one of the most interconnected periods the ancient world had ever known. Trade routes stretched across continents. Diplomacy bound kings together. Specialized economies flourished. To those living within it, the system likely appeared stable, even permanent. But stability can be deceptive. Highly interconnected systems are efficient, yet vulnerable. When everything depends on everything else, failure in one area can cascade across the whole network. The Bronze Age world functioned brilliantly, until it didn't. Modern societies share this paradox. Global supply chains, digital infrastructure, and economic interdependence bring unprecedented prosperity, but they also amplify risk. Disruption in one region can be felt worldwide within days. The Sea Peoples remind us that complexity does not guarantee resilience. One of the most sobering lessons of the Late Bronze Age collapse is the role of climate stress. Drought did not announce itself with fanfare. It crept in gradually. Failed harvests, shrinking reserves, rising prices. By the time political systems responded, the damage was already deep. Climate change today follows a similar pattern. Its effects are uneven, cumulative, and often indirect. Food insecurity, water scarcity, and environmental degradation rarely act alone. They interact with social, economic, and political pressures. In the Bronze Age, climate stress undermined authority and fueled migration. In the modern world, it threatens to do the same. Ancient Egyptian texts framed the Sea Peoples as invaders, external threats disrupting order. Modern analysis reveals a different reality. These groups were often displaced populations reacting to crisis. Migration did not create the collapse. It resulted from it, and then intensified it. This distinction matters today. Migration is frequently treated as the problem rather than the consequence of deeper systemic issues. History shows that movements of people are signals, indicators that something fundamental has gone wrong. The Sea Peoples were not anomalies. They were early warnings. It is easy to discuss collapse in abstract terms: trade networks, empires, political systems. But collapse is lived at the human level. Families abandon homes, communities fracture. Traditions are lost, skills disappear. Survival becomes the priority, and long-term planning fades. The Sea Peoples embodied this reality. They were not faceless forces. They were parents, children, artisans, and farmers making desperate choices in a world that no longer worked. Understanding this human dimension is essential. Systems fail not in isolation, but in ways that reshape millions of lives. Not all societies collapsed during the Late Bronze Age. Egypt survived. Phoenician cities adapted. New cultures emerged from the ruins. What separated survivors from failures was not strength alone, but flexibility. Rigid systems broke. Adaptive systems endured. This lesson resonates strongly today. Institutions built for stability must also be capable of change. Systems designed for efficiency must be resilient under stress. The ability to adjust, to decentralize, innovate, and redistribute resources can determine whether a society withstands crisis or collapses under it. Perhaps the most important lesson of all is this. Collapse does not mean the end of civilization. The Late Bronze Age world vanished, but humanity did not descend into permanent darkness. Instead, new societies emerged, often more resilient and more inclusive than what came before. The collapse cleared space for innovation. Iron replaced bronze. Writing spread. Political participation broadened. The classical world grew from the soil of disaster. This does not romanticize collapse. It acknowledges its costs while recognizing its transformative power. The story of the Sea Peoples is not a prediction of the future. History does not repeat itself in simple cycles, but it does reveal patterns. Complex systems are fragile. Environmental stress multiplies risk. Migration reflects deeper failures. Adaptability determines survival. These patterns are not ancient curiosities. They are ongoing dynamics. The value of studying the Sea Peoples lies not in fear, but in awareness. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us that waiting until crisis becomes visible may be too late. Systems often fail quietly before they fail dramatically. Early warning signs, environmental strain, economic inequality, political rigidity deserve attention long before they reach breaking point. The ancient world did not have the tools to fully understand its crisis. We do. That knowledge carries responsibility. The Sea Peoples were not monsters at the gates of civilization. They were people caught in the machinery of systemic failure. Their story urges humility. It reminds us that no society is immune to collapse, and that resilience lies not in denial, but in preparation, empathy, and adaptability. The ruins of the Bronze Age are not warnings carved in stone. They are lessons written in human experience. And those lessons are still waiting to be learned. The Sea Peoples did not arrive at the end of the Bronze Age like a sudden storm from a clear sky. They emerged from the shadows of a world already cracking under its own weight. By the time their ships appeared on the horizon, the foundations of civilization had begun to crumble. Palaces stood weakened, trade routes frayed, and once powerful kingdoms struggled to feed their people. In this sense, the Sea Peoples did not simply destroy the Bronze Age, they revealed its fragility. For centuries, the Sea Peoples were remembered almost exclusively through the words of their enemies. Egyptian inscriptions cast them as agents of chaos, barbarians who threatened divine order. Burning cities and fallen kings seemed to confirm the image. Yet archaeology and modern scholarship tell a more complex story. These were not a single nation or coordinated empire. They were fragmented groups, moving in desperation as much as ambition. Some arrived as raiders, others as refugees. Some fought for survival, others sought land, security, and stability. To reduce them to villains is to misunderstand the forces that shaped their movement. The Late Bronze Age was a world of extraordinary complexity. Its empires relied on intricate networks of trade, diplomacy, and specialization. Copper came from one region, tin from another. Food moved across borders. Knowledge flowed between courts. This system functioned beautifully until it didn't. Drought reduced harvests. Earthquakes destroyed cities. Trade disruptions rippled outward, causing shortages that armies and kings could not fix. Political authority weakened, trust eroded, and local unrest grew. The Sea Peoples entered a world already destabilized. They were not the sole cause of collapse. They were part of a larger chain reaction. One of the most striking images left behind by this period is found in Egyptian reliefs. Families traveling together, men, women, and children, packed onto carts and ships. This was not merely warfare. It was movement on a massive human scale. Entire communities were abandoning ancestral lands that could no longer sustain them. Fields had failed. Cities had fallen. Social contracts had broken down. Migration became the last option. The Sea Peoples were survivors navigating catastrophe, just as humans have always done in times of crisis. Survival did not mean peace. The arrival of large, displaced populations inevitably brought conflict. Coastal cities were attacked. Kingdoms fell. Defensive wars turned brutal. The destruction was real, and its human cost was immense. Yet from this violence came transformation. Old systems collapsed, but new ones took their place. Iron replaced bronze. Local governance replaced imperial bureaucracy. Oral traditions preserved memory when writing was lost. History did not end. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding of the Sea Peoples is that they were only destroyers. Archaeological evidence shows that many groups settled, intermarried, and built enduring societies. The Philistines developed distinctive cities and culture in the Levant. Aegean influences blended with local traditions. New identities formed. These communities were not relics of collapse, they were foundations of the future. The classical civilizations of the Iron Age, Phoenicians, Israelites, Greeks, emerged in the wake of this upheaval. Their world was shaped not in spite of collapse, but because of it. The Bronze Age collapse is often called a Dark Age, but darkness implies emptiness. In reality, it was a period of transition, chaotic, painful, but creative. Centralized power faded, but local innovation flourished. Literacy declined in some regions, yet oral storytelling preserved history and identity. New technologies democratized warfare and production. What ended was not civilization itself, but a particular way of organizing it. The story of the Sea Peoples resonates because it feels uncomfortably familiar. We live in an interconnected world, dependent on global systems for food, energy, and stability. Climate stress, migration, and political uncertainty shape modern headlines just as they shaped ancient history. Like the Bronze Age elites, modern societies often assume permanence. But history suggests otherwise. Complex systems can fail, empires can fracture, and change, when delayed too long, arrives all at once. The Sea Peoples serve as a warning, but not a prophecy. They remind us that collapse is rarely caused by a single event or enemy. It arises from accumulated stress, ignored vulnerabilities, and rigid systems unable to adapt.
They also offer a lesson. Human societies are resilient.
Even after catastrophe, people rebuild. Cultures evolve. New worlds emerge from old ashes. And finally, they present an opportunity to learn before crisis becomes collapse. In the end, the Sea Peoples were not anomalies. They were human beings responding to a world in crisis. Invaders when they had to be. Migrants when they could be. Settlers when they found land. Survivors above all. Their story is not confined to ancient inscriptions or ruined cities. It is part of humanity's ongoing struggle to adapt to change, to endure disruption, and to imagine new futures when old systems fail. The Bronze Age ended, but history did not. And as long as societies rise, strain, and transform, the story of the Sea Peoples will remain more than ancient history. It will remain a mirror,